Welcome, everybody, to the Neutral Zone Infraction Northwest podcast. I'm Drew, and we got episode 18 for us today. Sad weekend / early week in Seattle sports. Seahawks go down to the Atlanta Falcons in the divisional round of the playoffs. Edgar Martinez misses the Hall of Fame today, and, a number of things that we're going to talk about to sort of recap this NFL season for the Seahawks and talk about baseball going forward. First thing I want to do is, sort of talk about that loss to the Falcons. At times, it was both exhilarating and really disappointing. It was only really, super exhilarating for about the first quarter and a half. Well, first half, really. We went into the locker room behind, but not so far behind that we were in trouble. But the Seahawks only got a defensive stop against the Atlanta Falcons offense one time. And if your Seahawks offense, or Seahawks defense rather, a team who prides themselves on defense, exceptional defense in years past, one stop is just not going to cut it, especially not with the way that our offense is. I wouldn't consider it high-powered. I would consider it passable and enough to really get things done when our defense is playing great. And they did not play great. There were some good individual performances, but the defense as a whole and the Seahawks as a whole didn't really play great this last Saturday. And thus ends the season. That's sort of how the cookie crumbles, if you will, in the NFL. Of course, I'm upset about it. I always want to see the Seahawks, go as far as possible. But then you really start to think about it. These past 5 years in the Russell Wilson era, we've at least been to the divisional round of the playoff every single year. So that's definitely something to look back on and be proud of this year. It was always an up and down, mediocre-ish season for the Seahawks, especially in the regular season. Started out with the omen of the Russell Wilson injury, and then injuries started to stack up along with some key losses and close situations and a lot of, just sort of above average, but not as above average as we would like football from the Seattle Seahawks this year. And, that's just the way it goes. The franchise is strong. Like I said, 5 divisional round appearances, at least in the last 5 years. That's the sign of a healthy franchise. The only other franchise who's obviously done that is the New England Patriots, who are, still in it and my pick to go to the Super Bowl. So should be interesting for them going forward. But one of the things that I want to talk about, about that loss, I don't mean to rub salt in the wound. We're not going to dwell on it too much, but I want to kind of go over some things that I think sort of happened in that game and in ways that I think we might do it differently next time. At least if I was the coach. Not the coach. Pete Carroll is, and he does a darn good job. But there's some questionable things that happened. First off, not necessarily a questionable thing, but really a backbreaker, a killer, is the number of penalties that we received. Now, obviously, the Seahawks, I don't think were number 1 in penalties this year. I think we were closer to number 6 in total penalties in the regular season. But we have had this past year and previously a lot of penalties. We get a lot of them. Some of them are extracurricular. Sometimes there are things that are a little more questionable, like the number of offensive pass interference calls that we got called against us this year. But in this game, there weren't any egregious, oh my gosh, why was that a penalty? I mean, the holding on Devin Hester's 70-yard whatever return was a backbreaking penalty. It was an awful penalty. It really switched field position on us, and they gained a huge chunk of yardage, and that was really one of the biggest turning points of the game. Until that point, we were hot on their heels, but after that happened, it was all really downhill from there. But a lot of penalties. Holding, of course, is one of the biggest ones, and just generally sort of sloppy play all around. It was a great first drive that we had. Really got me pumped up. I'm like, that is exactly what a Seahawks drive should be. We start at the 25 and we drive the ball. It takes what did it take? 8 minutes? No, 7-something minutes and 14 plays with a 7-yard touchdown pass to Jimmy Graham at the end. Like, that is the perfect drive. We mixed run, we mixed pass. I think it was exactly even, and really had them on their heels and just made it look easy against that defense, that first drive. And then we sort of stalled out a little bit and never had a drive quite like that afterwards. And they came right back and did the same thing in like 4 plays, or just they really brought it to us right after we scored on them. They did the same thing to us. And I was thinking that our advantage in this matchup was our offense's ability to get on their defense and our defense's ability to maybe negate some of what the Atlanta Falcons have to offer on offense. Let me tell you what, there is no negating that offense whatsoever. It is a holy sword come to smite its enemies and leave their smoldering carcasses lying in the mud. There's nothing to be done against that Falcons offense. There's really nothing. I think that they beat the Green Bay Packers this week, and I think that they give the New England Patriots a run for their money in the Super Bowl. And I would definitely be rooting for them in that case. Definitely not the Steelers and definitely not the Patriots. So go NFC from here on out, for sure. As we moved on in the game and it got kind of a little bit more and more downtrodden, there was some curious play calling. The number of rushes to passes sort of shifted dramatically in the favor of pass, which you might expect if a team falls behind. But when the rush is working so well, like it was with Thomas Rawls, and it worked the previous week against Detroit, you got to stick to it. In this sort of a game where offense is your best defense, because they can't get on the field. And then we started kicking field goals, and it was all over from there. Because when we kick field goals and they get touchdowns, that's when the disparity in points starts to go up, and then we can do nothing from there. What you have to get first downs. You have to really continue with the game plan that you came in with. And when we switched hardcore to pass, and their pass rushers and their really pass defense in their secondary was able to kind of lock us down, it created problems for us. And I think that we could have utilized play action better if we kept the run and the pass similar, like in that first drive. So, as always, people are going to gripe and complain about the Seahawks play calling, put it at the feet of Darrell Bevell, and, rightfully so. A lot of the times he does some truly perplexing things, some real head scratchers, and he has 2 blind, swollen eyes and 3 eye patches on in the case of Jimmy Graham, and he didn't really provide anything in this game besides the 1 touchdown pass on that first drive. And that's a crying shame when you got a game changer like that. So all in all, recap of the game, it was disappointing. We lost. We go home. Falcons move on. Falcons, I hate to say it, they were a better team going in. And it was a long shot for us to win. We were definitely the underdogs. And I think that showed on Saturday. So what does the future hold for the Seahawks? What are we looking? What do you think that they're going to end up doing in the draft and in free agency going forward into next season? I mean, honestly, our roster is pretty solid. All of our big-name guys, there's not anybody that's going to be up really for free agency that's going to give us too many problems to try to re-sign. We got most of those defensive guys until at least 2018 in the case of Cam Chancellor, and then onward in progressing years from then on. I think it's important to keep an eye on both Earl Thomas and Tyler Lockett, but Earl Thomas especially to just make sure that he's able to come back from this injury. I don't want to rush him. I wouldn't be surprised if he was not ready by OTAs and even sat out for a great portion of training camp in the preseason. And I'm perfectly fine with all of that if he's ready to go starting the regular season next year. And it's not like a cookie cutter of a season that we got next year. The opponents are out home and away, and we've got a lot of mobile quarterbacks that we're going to be facing, and then of course Aaron Rodgers at home, and we play the NFC East, AFC South, which is like a weaker division, but could end up posing us some problems because a lot of those teams are on the up and coming, and when we have to travel to them, they're generally a long way away. So something to keep an eye on. I think that in free agency, we'll end up being pretty quiet. There's not been really a time in my recent memory that the Seahawks have gone out and made a huge splash in free agency with who they picked up. I think the biggest thing that you think of recently, probably Michael Bennett for cheap, though, and Cliff Averill, and then before that, Matt Flynn, the year that Russell Wilson was drafted. So I don't expect us to really do anything. I know people are wanting us to go pick up a name on our offensive line to try to get some veteran presence and really do that. I don't think that's going to happen. Number one, because there's not that big of a name out there, and we don't have the cap room to really support a big name like that anyway. It's just not feasible with the way that our team is structured right now. And Pete and John have shown just a stubbornness when it comes to not paying offensive linemen that I think will hold true going forward. I do think that the Seahawks will end up picking up somebody in the draft. I think first round is going to be an offensive lineman again, just like last year. I think that makes sense. Get a young guy who can really be a difference. I hope it's a tackle. Like, that's what I want. I haven't taken a good look at who's available and what the projections are. It's kind of hard this far out, but definitely I think an offensive tackle is going to be preferably left tackle would be great. I think that's going to be who we target in the first round. I think probably a defensive back in the second. Wouldn't be surprised if we picked up a running back or two. And obviously defensive linemen, we always seem to find them and pick them up. So a couple offensive linemen, a couple defensive linemen, probably a defensive back in the second or third round. We'll trade around like we always do, turn in one pick into two. In those middle rounds there where John and Pete just make mad heyday with the good stuff that they do. So should be interesting. I'll be keeping a close eye on that. Probably end up doing a draft preview podcast or draft post podcast to kind of recap who we get and what the plans are for that. Good news for the future is Tom Cable was in consideration for the San Francisco 49ers head coaching job, which is the last head coaching job available, but he withdrew his candidacy because that's basically going to be Kyle Shanahan, who was the offensive coordinator of the Falcons, so probably something to keep an eye on. I don't think that the addition of Kyle Shanahan is going to suddenly make the 49ers a great team by any stretch of the word. He's a great offensive mind, but really what he has going in Atlanta is the sheer amount of weapons that they have, and they just don't have those weapons in San Francisco. Hopefully they would give him 3 years or so at least to make a turnaround of some kind, and I would look for them to be good in 3 to 4 years for sure. All right, so that's really where the Seahawks are. As always, if you have questions like that maybe I didn't answer here, or if you had a specific question about the game or the draft or what you think we're going to do going forward into next season, you can, as always, tweet me at Neutral Zone NW on Twitter and email me Neutral Zone Infraction NW at gmail.com. So the other thing I want to talk about in this podcast, this is going to be probably the last podcast for a little while because we don't have any sports going on right now. Pitchers and catchers report in 28 days for the Mariners. But other than that, we don't have a basketball team. We don't have a hockey team. And as much as I want those two things, we don't have them right now. So there's not a lot for me to talk about, which is fine. But I did want to ask you guys in this podcast here, and now I realize that not everyone who's a football fan, which is, this podcast has been primarily focused around, is a baseball fan and vice versa. But if you know a baseball fan or you are a baseball fan, let me know in the comments below or, any of the channels that I mentioned before, what you would like to see in a baseball podcast. Obviously, it's going to be centered around the Seattle Mariners, who, of course, are my team. And kind of what do you want to see out of that? I don't know how often that it would happen. It's easier in football because there's one game a week. With baseball, it's a little bit different because there are so many games over a stretch of time. So I'll work on something and be sure to let you guys know in the first of those baseball podcasts. So definitely let me know. I have a few ideas toying around in my head, but I'm always happy to hear from you and know what questions you have, and the feedback is always great. So the last thing that I want to talk about, this is going to end up being a shorter podcast probably just because I'm at the end of my sheet here, is what happened today. Today being January the 18th at nighttime when I record this. Edgar misses the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame was announced today. It was Jeff Bagwell, Tim Raines, and was it Vlad Guerrero? No. Let me look this up here real snappy. There was one other name. He just snuck in there too. It was like 76% or something. You need 75 to get into the Hall of Fame, but he got 76. Who's this last name here? All right, so I found this, and I've got some legitimate numbers here for us. It was Ivan Rodriguez, not Vladimir Guerrero. Vladimir Guerrero missed by 3.3%, which is kind of sucky. The votes as it went in was Jeff Bagwell, number one, with 86.2% of the vote. Tim Raines, 86%, and Ivan Rodriguez was 76%. Trevor Hoffman missed by 1%. He had 74% of the vote. Vlad Guerrero, 71.7%, and then was Edgar Martinez at 58.6%. So year-over-year growth, last year he got 41%, and he's got 2 more years of eligibility left. Now, with that, you got to be thinking, a lot of people are projecting that he makes it in not next year, but the year after that. Because it's hard because people go out and then people become eligible, and I haven't looked that far into it as to see kind of who is going to become eligible that would take votes away from him. If you don't know how it works, the Baseball Writers Association, in this case it was 442 people, get a ballot with all the Hall of Fame eligible people, and they're allowed to pick 10. And the percentage of your name that appears on those 442 ballots, as it was this year, is the percentage that you need, over 75%, to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. So there was a big purge from last year to this year of sort of the old writers, the ones that haven't covered baseball since, I think if you haven't covered it in the last, I think they did 9 years, then you don't have a vote in the Baseball Hall of Fame anymore, because you had all these guys that had covered baseball in the 90s and the 80s who still had a vote and weren't voting for DH specifically, like Edgar Martinez. And that's super frustrating if you're a Mariners fan and you want to see your guy get in. But we definitely see an uptick in the amount of votes that he got this year. And I definitely think that he has the possibility of being able to make it, but it is looking more and more like a long shot. Earlier, when they had projected, I think there were 57% of the votes cast or something like that, and he was sitting at 65%. I was more optimistic, this can happen. He only needs 10% to get there, but it didn't work out. He ended up going down in his percentage. And it is frustrating because, and I made my case for Edgar in the Hall of Fame earlier on in this podcast, not this specific episode, but a previous episode. And he, all his offensive numbers are slam dunk Hall of Fame numbers. And they're just not putting him in because he's a DH. But they're going to put Big Papi in as soon as he becomes eligible because of what he did in October. Well, baseball's a team sport. And as us people in the Northwest know, the Seattle Mariners were not always the best team in baseball, specifically for a lot of the years that Edgar Martinez was doing his thing. I mean, he hit 342 one year, he hit 356 one year, which is just eye-poppingly crazy, and it is so hard to be a DH to not have the rhythm of playing in the field and then going to hit. I mean, people who follow baseball now know that Nelson Cruz bats way better when he plays in the field than when he is the DH. And that's just because of the mind disconnect that you have when you're waiting on a bench for an hour and a half between times when you got to go play. But Edgar figured it out. He was the guy that learned how to do it. He kept himself in the cage. He was on the bike, and he was in the dugout talking to the other guys, getting scouting reports, giving scouting reports, even as a player. I mean, get this guy in the Hall of Fame. We have a gosh darn street named after him in Seattle next to our stadium. Get him in there. It's mind-blowing to me. Of course, I'm biased, but seriously, take an objective look at what you're looking at. And don't tell me because he didn't stand at a base for 3/4 of his career that he wasn't Hall of Fame worthy. That's like taking some of these pitchers that weren't the best fielders and not allowing them to get in. So explain that one to me, baseball writers. Craziness. But the long and the short of it is he didn't get in. And, we move on. Next year, he's got an opportunity. The year after that, that's his last shot. So we got some time, do some lobbying. Maybe I'll send some strongly worded letters or emails. Or maybe I'll just write DH in orange paint on the houses of these guys. I don't know. All the ballots are public, so there are definitely going to be names associated with these no votes that, if you're savvy enough and have a computer and know how to email, you could literally contact these people. So, maybe I'll create an expose, or maybe I'll just leave that to the Seattle Mariners organization that have done a great job being supportive of their guy, Edgar. Good news is we got him in the dugout as our hitting coach for this year, and seeing the uptick in our hitting once he took over last year, I think really helps us. So it should be fun going forward. That's really all I got for this podcast. Sort of a somber, not a lot of fun in this one, but that's okay. If you didn't hear me before, I obviously pick the Patriots and the Falcons to meet in the Super Bowl. Not going to do a podcast really until baseball season starts again. So if for some reason that does happen, then it's going to be, I would pick the Falcons in the Super Bowl, just because I'm not going to pick the New England Patriots, because that would be sad. I would not want to see that. If Green Bay wins, then Green Bay. If the Steelers win, then good for them, but also go NFC teams. So that's it. That's my podcast for this week. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me every week and listening to this show. Remember to like, share, subscribe, do all those social media things. And tell your friends. Like I said, if you got a baseball friend, maybe doesn't like football, and he's like, man, wish there was a cool baseball podcast for me to listen to. Well, you're in luck, friend of my random listener. There's going to be one. It's a coming. Haven't figured out the details yet, but tell me what you want, and I'll make it happen. So this has been episode 18. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week.